So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the last Wednesday seminar of the fall semester. I think we're going to reconvene. First one will be February 2nd. Is that right, Andrew? Yeah, so February 2nd. So I'll have a nice break from this, but looking forward to seeing everyone back in the spring. Also, before we get going, I want to give a special shout out to Chris and Andrew for actually making these seminars work virtually and in hybrid way. So thank you very much, guys. This was an entirely new experiment for us, as most of you know. We didn't know what it would be like, but I think it's been a terrific success. And I wanted to make sure that we thank them because it's really important for allowing us to do what we do. So I'm really delighted today to welcome to MIT SSP Emma Ashford. She's a senior fellow with the New American Engagement Initiative in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security at the Atlantic Council. So this is almost like Russian dolls, but some of you may be familiar with this group, which has some other individuals that we know. Her work there focuses on questions of grand strategy, international security, and the future of U.S. foreign policy. Previously, she was a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. Her writing has appeared in all the places where you would expect to see it: Foreign Affairs, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Texas National Security Review, War on the Rocks, among others. She also has a bi-weekly column called It's Debatable, which is in foreign policy, and I encourage you to take a look at that. I don't think the column is debatable, but the opposing positions themselves are. It's quite terrific. She's a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations and received her PhD in Foreign Affairs from the University of Virginia. Her first book, Oil, the State and War, the Foreign Policies of Petrostates, is forthcoming from Georgetown University Press in May of next year. So Emma, welcome to MIT.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I'm going to take my mask off. Please let me know if anybody feels uncomfortable about that, but I'm a long way away here. So it's great to be here. I really appreciate the invitation to come and speak to people, particularly in person. And, you know, I know, let me just start by saying that, you know, I know there's a bunch of PhD students in the room. I am somebody who went through a PhD and ended up going off and doing policy work instead of going into a tenure track academic position. And so while I'm going to talk about my paper, and, you know, I'm sure most of the discussion will focus on that, if people have questions in the Q&A about careers or that path into studying policy, I am more than happy to answer those. And I just wanted to say that up front. So I'm going to base my remarks today on a paper that I published a couple of months back in Foreign Affairs. And, you know, the title of that paper ended up being Strategies of Restraint. And the broad idea was that we're at a moment in the debate over US foreign policy where change in America's grand strategy, in America's foreign policy, where change actually seems possible for the first time in perhaps 30 years. There was a moment immediately after the collapse of the Soviet Union where there was debate on this and change was possible. And I think we are entering a new moment of change. And so, you know, I think we have started to see the seeds of a shift in US foreign policy, away from the old consensus that surrounded US foreign policy and towards something, but it's not entirely clear what yet. And I think there are several options. I'm going to talk about them as I go through here. But I think the future is open for US foreign policy in a way that it has not been for quite some time. So let me just start, I guess, by saying a couple of words about, you know, the old consensus, or the consensus on US foreign policy that has governed US foreign policies since effectively the mid 1990s. And, you know, people will call that different names. They'll call it liberal internationalism. Primacy is another one you hear thrown around a lot. I tend to conceptualize this approach to foreign policy as something like transformative primacy. So the idea that America would maintain its military primacy over all other countries in the world, but also that there was a very strong element of using the unipolar moment, the moment when America was at its strongest compared to other countries in the world, to effect transformations in the world. And I think we can see this, you know, not just in the war on terror, not just in the invasion of Iraq, but also in things like a more aggressive approach to nuclear non-proliferation in the post-Cold War period. Interventions aimed at sort of ending humanitarian suffering, at promoting liberalism, at preventing dictators from committing atrocities, at expanding alliances in Europe and elsewhere. And so just a series of US foreign policy decisions aimed at trying to transform the world into a more peaceable, pacifistic, cooperative place. And that, I think, helps to frame one of the reasons why we're seeing somewhat of a movement for change at the moment. Because those initiatives were not all failures. There were some notable successes for US foreign policy in the post-Cold War period. You might think of the Bush administration's PEPFAR program in Africa. You might think of the JCPOA under the Obama administration, the Good Friday Agreement in the 1990s. So there are these notable successes, but there's also just a litany of failures. The failures of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the failure of the intervention in Libya, some of the hostilities that grew out of American intervention in the Balkans in the 1990s, growing revisionism and pushback from states like Russia and China, and also a growing antipathy within Western countries towards US foreign policy and towards some of the tenets of liberal internationalism, towards free trade, towards open immigration, towards the idea that there are collective security structures as opposed to national ones. And so I think that's one big factor that's been driving this change. And then the other factor is structural changes in the balance of power. So most visible, obviously, is the rise of China, but it is not just the rise of China. We are also seeing India, other countries in Asia rising. We are seeing substantive regulatory and financial power increasingly concentrate in the European Union. And we are seeing other countries around the world increasingly able to affect the course of world affairs compared to the period in the late 90s, early 2000s. The result has been what I would describe as sort of a splintering of the consensus that has guided US foreign policy since the mid-1990s. In effect, you used to have a situation where sort of liberal hawks on the left and neoconservatives on the right largely agreed. They didn't agree on everything in US foreign policy, but they did largely agree on what US foreign policy was trying to do, that it was trying to be quite transformative, that it was trying to push liberalism and democracy, that it was trying to maintain American primacy. That consensus is coming apart. And the way I like to think about it is that I think different groups in the US foreign policy debate are learning different lessons from the failures of our foreign policy in recent years. So, for example, a lot of conservatives see the global war on terror as a failure of motivations. Right? It's not that we failed trying to fight terrorism, it's that we failed because we imported things like nation building into the process. Many would also argue that we failed because the military had their hands tied by some of these liberal ideals that prevented them from being as tough on terrorists as they could have been. And so on both sides of the aisle, you hear different narratives for why the war on terror failed. And so these are some of the factors that I think are prompting this debate right now. So let me just briefly talk about how I see sort of the landscape of the US foreign policy debate at the moment. So I think there's three big groups. The first are a contingent of liberal internationalists, but it is a liberal internationalism that is somewhat chastened and is somewhat dialing down on the goals that it had during the post-Cold War period. So they're largely eschewing the notion of regime change through military force. They're largely eschewing the notion that we could go out and engage in nation building abroad. But this liberal internationalism maintains many of the other tenets of the post-Cold War consensus. So things like a large alliance network, things about protecting and spreading liberalism, albeit not at the point of the sword, and about trying to maintain American military primacy. Then there's a second group, and this is found mostly on the Republican side of the aisle, that you might call unilateralists, America firsters, who are traditional Jacksonians, but it's a Jacksonianism that's taken with sort of Trumpian characteristics, I might call it. So it's very combative, it's very confrontational. The lesson that they learned from the global war on terror was that we shouldn't care about playing nice with others and we should focus on American strength. And so this point of view still sees an America that's very active in the world, but it's mostly active through either military strength or things like sanctions. So predominantly coercive measures to achieve American interests. And it is very focused on sovereignty and inherently nationalistic, where the liberal internationalism of today still has that sort of internationalist collective security flavor. And then a third group, which people here at MIT are probably familiar with and sometimes others aren't, is what we might call restrainers. And I'll talk a little more about what that means later, but in the broadest possible terms, restrainers agree that the US is remarkably secure in its national security, that there are growing flaws in US foreign policy, whether it's wars of choice, whether it's allied free riding, and that shifts in the world mean that America may need to retrench in order to maintain its security and prosperity. So those are kind of the three groups that we're talking about. And I think one notable feature that I would point out is that the post-Cold War consensus was called a consensus because it was bipartisan, right? It had adherents on both the left and the right, and that meant that US foreign policy was pretty consistent during that period, even through shifts in the presidency. Today, most of the liberal internationalists fall in the Democratic Party. Most of the America Firsters fall in the Republican Party, and restraint is really the only bipartisan option that's actually on the table. And what this potentially means is that we might be entering a period where we see swings in US foreign policy between administrations. We've already seen this with the Trump administration, where they sort of withdrew from the TPP, ended America's participation in the JCPOA, and now we've got the Biden administration trying to get back at least into the JCPOA. So we see these pretty sudden swings between administrations. And it's not that that didn't happen before, but it was far rarer than it has been today. And so this is one concern of this sort of splintering of US foreign policy. So I'm probably running massively over time here, but let me add to the confusion by saying that restraint is not monolithic. And one of the things I do in the article that I mentioned is I talk about the different things that restraint is used to mean. And I'll highlight two big ones here, right? So the one you're all probably familiar with is the theoretical version, right? So theoretically, restrainers are those who subscribe to either restraint, as Dr. Posen has proposed it, or to some variant of offshore balancing. And so, not all realists are restrainers, not all restrainers are realists, but there is a sizable overlap there. And theoretically, these grand strategies are what we might consider as restrained grand strategies. But then there is a broader meaning of restraint as it's come to be used in Washington and in other countries. And that is sort of a coalition of people that's pushing for more restrained US foreign policy. So that is the anti-war left, the libertarian right, deficit hawks, paleo-conservatives, veterans groups. There are lots of different groups in here. And that meaning of restraint has become much more common, even as it is far fuzzier than the theoretical constructs that we might think of. And I'll just highlight sort of a couple of big things that those groups might disagree on, right? They might disagree on China. They might disagree on trade. They might disagree on the value of international institutions, right? So that's like three of the biggest things in political science that those two groups might disagree on. So I guess let me just dial down onto the sort of the theoretical part of it, because I think, that's more interesting for us from an analytical point of view. So the two big flavors of restraint that we've seen are restraint and offshore balancing. And for me, I see the core differences between the two as how far away from the United States do you draw the line? So are you concerned about hegemons in other regions and the ability for the US to get excluded? How do you view trade and the necessity of America's overseas markets to be protected? How much do you think the stopping power of water matters. So in practical terms, those are sort of big questions, but in practical terms, I think offshore balancers today care a lot about Asia. They care a lot about China. They're worried about China's rise and would like to take a more proactive approach there. Most restrainers, those who advocate for restraint, are less concerned. The reason I bring this up, because this is probably not news to you, but because in the search for sort of a practical consensus on US foreign policy, so shifting from the level of grand strategy down to US foreign policy, these differences really matter. Because within this sort of restraint coalition, within this third group, the liberal internationalists, the America Firsters, and the restrainers disagree on all manner of things. They disagree on China. They disagree on whether the US should defend Taiwan. They disagree on what role the US should play in European security. They disagree on trade. And the victories that restrainers have had so far, that is the success that they've had in nudging US foreign policy towards restraint, have mostly come in the areas where restrainers all agree, particularly on the question of the war on terror in the Middle East. Going forward, there's far less consensus within that group on where US foreign policy should be going. And so one thing that we could see in coming years is sort of both political parties pooling the parts of restraint that they like and trying to implement it rather than restraint being a more coherent bloc. In practical terms, I would also argue that both restraint and offshore balancing, as they are written as grand strategies, give insufficient attention to a couple of things. So they give insufficient attention to the impact of foreign policy and of foreign actors on liberalism at home. So whether US foreign policy has destabilizing effects on US democracy at home, whether foreign actors can exploit internal divisions to worsen things here at home. I think both also give insufficient attention, particularly to the value of non-military tools and engagement with the world. Now, historically, at least, offshore balancing, if you look at the British context in the 19th century, has relied very heavily on non-military tools. But most of the texts that we have on these subjects today focus instead on the military dimension, on that retrenchment, without discussing the sort of engagement that needs to replace it. And then I think the final area where both sort of don't really answer some key questions is considering the impact of path dependence in US foreign policy and what is feasible to change in the near term and on the impacts that sudden shifts in US foreign policy can have. And I'll give one example here. So the withdrawal from Iraq that the Obama administration withdrew ended up actually backfiring. When they withdrew in 2009, it ended up helping to precipitate the rise of ISIS. And the Obama administration felt compelled to go back into that conflict. And so I think that's one good example of how an attempt by policymakers to shift towards restraint ended up pushing a circumstance that made it more difficult to do over the long term. And so I think that's one area where these grand strategies, which are often written in a sort of tabula rasa form, sort of ignore the possibility or ignore the problem of path dependence in US foreign policy. So I'm going to say just a few words more and then wrap up because I don't want to take up all the time. But in the article, the sort of approach that I advocate for is what I call realist internationalism. And I think this is one of the more practical options to minimize the costs of today's US foreign policy and maximize the gains while bearing in mind those constraints. So, I base this idea in a sort of very purposefully ecumenical realism. So states are the key actors in international affairs. They're guided by security. We live in a state of anarchy, general realist principles, but not by the strictures of structural realism necessarily. So this is very much a theory of foreign policy. This is not a theory of international security. The key goals of liberal internationalism would be to focus on US security, US prosperity, US liberalism at home. This means maintaining trade. This means trying to steer the world towards multi-polarity rather than bipolarity to the extent that we're able to do so in the coming decades. And in particular, this means avoiding great power war wherever possible, or if at all possible. So a few core principles that I'd advocate here, and I'm happy to talk more about this and more about what it might mean in practice in the Q&A. But America should abrogate primacy, military primacy as a goal, and should instead seek military sufficiency to achieve those goals. We should downsize US alliance commitments, not necessarily through breaking or withdrawing from those commitments, but by aggressive burden shifting to capable allies wherever possible, and by building new structures, even within those alliances, that can help to substitute for the American presence. And then in particular, I would argue that we need to move past the notion of American leadership in the international system, and instead start to think about America's role as first among equals. America as a facilitator, a convener, a country that can build coalitions to solve collective action problems, rather than a country that needs to lead the way on every problem. Prioritizing the preservation of US values and liberalism at home, not necessarily abroad, and adopting what you might call a do no harm approach to human rights. So looking for ways in which we can help to improve human rights abroad, but without facing fights that we can't necessarily win. So rather than looking at sanctions as a coercive tool to try and coerce behavior change in states that we disagree with, we don't have many ties with, consider the ways in which we could pressure allies to improve their human rights, or perhaps to stop making things worse. So US arms sales to Saudi Arabia would be one example. So, you could consider this approach either a broader version of offshore balancing that includes sort of non-military factors, or you could go all the way back to the early 1990s and call it a far more selective engagement. But I think this approach is one that would sort of maximize the benefits of cooperation globally, remaining internationalist, remaining liberal, while minimizing the risks that more transformative liberal internationalism has put on US foreign policy. And so I'm going to wrap up there. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. The floor is open. Please raise your hand on Zoom or in the room, and I will keep a running list. And please raise high. So I see, let's see, right in the back. Right, you want to go ahead? Sure.
Are we coming up to the microphone?
Then why don't you come to the microphone? Yeah, especially since you are in the back.
Hello, Wright Smith, third year PhD student. I am fastening on to something you said as one of the prescriptions at the end of your talk, which is that the US should try to encourage multipolarity as opposed to bipolarity. And not all, but several of the really canonical realist thinkers are very skeptical of multipolarity being more stable and are concerned that it's a much more chaotic and war-prone kind of system. So I'm curious, why should the US encourage multipolarity instead of bipolarity? Are those thinkers wrong, or is it actually still going to be easier to manage given sort of the power differentials we see?
Yeah, that's a really good question. No, I think they're probably right that multipolarity is inherently more chaotic and probably more prone to war. The thing that I tend to think is missing from some of those accounts, the ones that say that bipolarity is inherently very stable, that it doesn't lead to war, is if you think about the actual practical, if you think about the Cold War, right? Yes, it was stable. It wasn't stable everywhere. There were brush wars, but it was stable under the constraints of nuclear annihilation, right? The stakes could not have been higher if that stability failed. And so I think that what's missing from many of those accounts is, is an understanding or an acknowledgement of the stakes that come with conflict in each kind of system. So I think that in a multipolar world, we could indeed see more low-level conflict between states, particularly if there aren't hegemons like the US or the Soviet Union sort of stabilizing things, managing where there's conflict. But I think that conflict is lower stakes. And certainly from the point of view of US security, I think it's a worthwhile trade-off to trade some extra conflict in other regions for not having to be concerned that a conflict in the South China Sea will necessarily blow up into a nuclear exchange. And so that's kind of where I come down on that. I agree that's what the literature says on stability and multipolarity, but I think in the context of the nuclear world, I'm not sure if that makes as much sense as it used to.
Thanks. Nick Ackert.
Hi, Dr. Ashford. My name's Nick Ackert. I'm a third-year PhD student as well. Thank you so much. One thing that you said that resonated with me especially was treating partisanship as a potential variable for calculating where the US may go next in its grand strategy. And one thing that I was curious about was if you look at the Trump administration's foreign policy, despite the emphasis on America first, US military spending remained at an all-time high. We invested a ton in our nuclear arsenal. And despite all of the hullabaloo about retrenching from our alliances, particularly in East Asia, the US didn't really abrogate any of those commitments. And I felt like the Trump administration was a most likely case of, say, sort of a hardcore kind of Republican strategy, or at least what the party has become now. And so my question is, if there was less of an impact there than we anticipated, and if we go back to the Cold War and look at the relative unity of both Republican and Democrat responses to the Soviets and to containment, should we view partisanship as an important indicator, or are there private or bureaucratic interests or this kind of persistent idea of US liberalism that may be an equally, if not more important driver of US foreign policy and grand strategy in the future? Thank you.
Great, thanks. So I think this is, again, an interesting question, right? During the Trump administration, we might have expected to see major changes to US foreign policy. And it's notable that the adults in the room, as they were often called, the foreign policy establishment that was brought in to staff the administration did, for the most part, manage to stop Donald Trump from carrying out some of his worst impulses, but some of them were actually fairly good ideas, but he was not able to carry them out, whether they were bad or good. So, for example, we know at this point that he wanted to withdraw the US from NATO. And we can all debate the merits of whether just withdrawing the US from NATO overnight is a good idea or not, but it was the people around him that managed to stop it. So that said, though, I think there's been a notable shift in the Republican foreign policy establishment, Trump aside, right? So ignore the person, the flamboyant, crazy person of Donald Trump. And if you look at what elites in the Republican foreign policy establishment are saying and writing these days, they are coming around to a view of the world that used to be that John Bolton was all out there on his own, arguing for a US foreign policy that didn't take part in international institutions, that focused on sovereignty, that used force and coercion rather than anything else. And it used to be that most Republicans didn't really follow that worldview, or didn't really apply that worldview in practice. And I think what we're seeing is more and more of them do. So one thing I'd call your attention to is the fight that's been going on for the last 6 months, 9 months over Nord Stream 2. So the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, if you haven't been following this or don't know, pipeline between Russia and Germany. The Russians want it, the Germans want it, Eastern European countries, members of NATO, don't want it. And the US has been trying to kill this. So under Trump, Congress passed sanctions on German companies building the pipeline. So we were sanctioning our German allies over this pipeline. The Biden administration waived those sanctions because it wanted to rebuild transatlantic ties. And since then, Republicans in Congress have been trying to pass bills with no waiver for national security that would basically mandate sanctions go back on German companies. So, this is a sort of a Republican approach to foreign policy that is almost entirely unilateralist, doesn't care what allies think, doesn't care what other countries think, just tries to impose what people in Washington think on other countries, whether they are allies, partners, foes, whatever you want to call them. And so that is the shift that I think is more interesting, because I am not particularly interested or concerned. I don't think Donald Trump is going to come back and make a bunch of foreign policy changes, but the next Republican president will likely, he or she will not be a neoconservative. They will be shaped by that worldview instead.
Thank you.
Julian Rigby.
Hi, Julian Rippey. I'm a fourth-year student here at SSP. Long time admirer of your work, so thanks for coming to talk. I was, again, just sort of, and everyone's zeroing in on sort of your last couple paragraphs here, but I'm also going to do that. So you say that one thing that the U.S. should do with its allies especially is pursue kind of burden shifting. And you say that there should be some other arrangements made to offset that. So I'm wondering what you see as, like, one, what are things concretely that the US can give up? I guess especially, right, with maybe Taiwan and Japan. And what are things that they can put in place that will actually make a difference there? Is that military spending, political, economic, whatever?
Sure. So I really appreciate people narrowing in on the last part of this, because it's the part that is the least well fleshed out and still needs to be fully written. So I really appreciate criticism and feedback on this. On burden shifting, so two key areas we could think about it. So the European and the Asian theater. You asked primarily about Asia. So I'm a realist, so I am somewhat concerned about the rise of China. And I do think that the US needs to strengthen its ties in Asia rather than actually dial them back. Now, I don't necessarily think that means lots of boots on the ground. Certainly no more than is there already, perhaps less. So, for example, I would oppose the current buildup in Taiwan, but I do think that there are other areas, arms sales, joint exercises, where we could help those countries to build up their own capabilities. I think the picture looks very different. And in Asia. And so the one thing that I would say is we should keep those arrangements as flexible as possible. I think one lesson or one key takeaway from what's happened in Europe over the last 30 years is that alliance arrangements can calcify and live on well past their intended purpose. And I think that is something we want to avoid in Asia. So we need to keep those as flexible as possible. In Europe, though, I think there is much more of a rationale, much more of a good reason to consider trying to basically get America out of Europe to the point where it is just a guarantor of last resort and nothing more. So trying to encourage European states to build up their domestic capabilities, and that is not as easily said as done because there is no consensus within Europe on whether to do that or not. So a couple of approaches that might work. One would be backing the French push for European Union military buildup. Within the context of sort of, French defense, because they are by far the most eager to do it, and encouraging particularly France, but other European countries to work with Eastern European counterparts that are also building up. So basically, coalition of the willing, I hate the phrase, but coalition of the willing within Europe to try and replace the US presence. Another way to think about it would be to think about building sort of constellations of countries within NATO that share common interests. So one of the problems within the NATO alliance is that the different countries have very different security concerns, and therefore it's almost impossible to get unanimity on what should be built up and when. And the US has typically just filled those gaps. So Italy is concerned about the Mediterranean, Poland is concerned about Russia. So trying to build smaller groupings within NATO where countries that are concerned about common threats could build up common capabilities. And that's going to take a very long time. But that is one slightly more practical way to approach this rather than just saying Europe needs to do more and moving on with it. I see a two-finger there.
Is that a two-finger, Eric, or is that a one-finger?
It was a two-finger. So
Okay.
I wonder if you can speak a little bit more about this, your variation preferences between Asia and Europe. Is it that you view Russia as a less aggressive threat to your social security? Is it that you think that partners in Europe are better able to do some kind of? Yeah.
I think it's I'm ambivalent about intentions. I don't really think intentions matter that much at all in this context. It's all capabilities. I think that China has the capacity, and here's where I'm pretty classic offshore balance. I think China has the capacity to dominate the region, which is to say it has the capacity to exclude the US from the region in terms of trade, in terms of politics. Russia does not have anything remotely approaching capacity to do that in Europe. The Russian military is far more capable than it was 10 years ago. But the conversations that we're having in Washington right now are about, well, could Russia take half of Ukraine? Maybe it could, probably could, right? If that is the debate that we are having, Russia is not a substantive military threat to Europe, and those countries are more than capable of building up to meet that threat.
So, since the C word was mentioned, can you say more about China in your approach? Because if there is one area of consensus in Congress on foreign policy today, it does appear to be China. And I've always got China on my brain, but I was just wondering, like, what would the realist how would this specifically be applied to deal with the problem that you just posed of China?
Yeah, so I hesitate to say anything on China, surrounded by people who know far more about China than myself. But in terms of sort of US policy, I think the needle that needs to be threaded, which is going to be very, very difficult to thread, is how to signal to China that the US is not completely withdrawing from Asia while not simultaneously creating some sort of build-up security spiral. That's not a new insight. That's an insight I think everybody should probably have. And I think it's going to require attention to a couple of things. So one is to crisis escalation measures, confidence building measures. This is something, my initiative, we put a couple of papers out earlier this year. We know the administration is actually putting them into practice, is trying to build up some of the confidence measures, mill-to-mill exchanges, a hotline between the countries, military coordination on various issues. These are the things that we had by the late Cold War that helped to stabilize that relationship. And so focusing on those might help. Another is thinking more clearly about the places where our presence might be causing anxiety in Beijing. And this is where, my energy background, I think, forces me to think mostly about this one. US naval presence in parts of Asia, particularly in the Straits of Malacca and Lombok near Indonesia, has been viewed for some time in Beijing as a potential military threat, right? The US could itself cut off China's oil supplies from the Middle East. That is a massive threat. That is a threat big enough that when the US was in a similar situation in 1980, we got the Carter Doctrine and the Gulf War out of it. So that is one example of a place where I think if we're not careful, we could see sort of security spiral dynamics. So, my primary concern is how do we sort of hedge so that we keep our hand in Asia, so that we make sure that we are not simply ceding Asia to China without necessarily sparking some kind of confrontation. And that, I'm not sure, I don't think I have the answer there necessarily, but I think at a very least working on those practical things might help us avoid something worse.
Very pleasant.
So thanks for coming up, Emma. It's good to see you. I was going to ask a question about burden sharing as well, but I think it was asked and answered. But I do want to come back to the question that Taylor has asked and to the distinction you raised between restraint in Asia as an approach to China versus offshore balancing. And, I've been thinking about restraint for a long time, and I've been trying to think about a restraint policy to address the rise of China. And I don't think I've really come up with one yet, and I'm not sure that there is among restrainers a consensus on that matter. But I do think that restrainers are the true owners of offshore balancing. And those who've claimed offshore balancing as their strategy are being disingenuous. The strategy they recommend is basically there can be one hegemon in Asia. It's either China or the United States, and it's going to be the United States, right? Those who talk about offshore balancing in Asia now are really talking about offshore containment. Right, that's the way I would characterize it. So I don't really think there is a restraint strategy for China yet. I think if there is one, it will have that offshore balancing flavor. Not heavily institutionalized, quite flexible, not hegemony from the sea. Something that starts from the premise that burden sharing and burden shifting should be central, that everyone there has an interest and they should all play a role. That's sort of the direction that restraint should be looking for, but I don't think it's a well worked out position. And I think there's a reason for that, because I think it's a very complicated problem, right? My own characterization of the offshore balancing school is just, kind of get out your old NATO Soviet stuff and do search and replace and, start up the engine in Asia and just acknowledge that the engine is going to work from the first and second island chains, because it can't start on the continent because there's really only two countries there, especially in East Asia. It's China and Russia. Neither are friends of ours. So anyway, I'm babbling here, but you see the point that I'm making, right? That the version of offshore balancing that's being sort of promulgated, and I'll just name a name. I'd say John Mearsheimer's probably been the person that's forwarded this. I just don't think it's offshore balancing. I think it's something very different. And I just wonder what your reaction is to my characterization. I'm trying to be provocative here, but I wonder what your reaction is.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. Getting asked to come and do a talk on restraint in front of a room including Barry Posen is a little nerve-wracking, I'll be honest. So I think you're right. I think there's no restraint consensus on China. I think what's really interesting is if you go back 5 years, I think there was more of a consensus that China wasn't a threat, that it really wasn't a problem, that we could deal with it when it became a problem. And the shift that I have seen, this is just anecdotal from talking to people. The shift that I have seen is that I think there's now more of a realization that China is somewhat of a concern and that we need a new position. And again, I think it's going to come down to some flavor of offshore balancing. With regard to your comment on sort of offshore containment, offshore balancing, I think it's about how you conceptualize hegemony. Because you're right that in Asia, we start from this place where China's just so big that they're already the hegemon, right? I like to conceptualize hegemony not as size or military power. I like to conceptualize it as the ability to exclude. So if China can exclude us from Asia in terms of preventing us from trading with Asia, preventing us from dealing diplomatically with other countries without sort of going through them. If China dominates the region to the extent that America is effectively shut out, that is the hegemony I think is problematic. And I don't think that is how, for example, I don't think that's how John Mearsheimer conceptualizes it. I think he thinks about it very much more in this sort of military sense. And so for him, thinking about it just in pure military terms, I think he's already at the point where he thinks the US needs to be onshore to deal with it. I don't think we're quite there yet. So, I mean, I will say I sort of drew a sharp line in my remarks between sort of restraint and offshore balancing. I do tend to think these things are much more of a spectrum, right? So I would probably fall somewhere between those two. Does that answer your question, or does that?
No, but you're
No.
right. But it's not a criticism issue. I think the debate is in the early stages.
Yeah.
I asked the question in the spirit of trying to clarify and move people forward, including myself.
But in that sense, then this is again on my mind. So what would military sufficiency in Asia look like for you? Because I guess regardless of one's definition of hegemony, there is a military component to it, and that is the one that at least seems to be attracting a lot of attention in the United States. DoD describing China as the basic challenge, and so what is sufficiency kind of practice and just say in this region? I mean, don't apply to another region. That's my. I'm curious what you think.
Yeah, so again, I think Asia is the most difficult region, right? The others are all much, much easier than Asia in this context. I mean, I think it has to be primarily naval. It has to be primarily about maintaining access to sea lanes, but also the capability to either sort of apply force to defend countries like Japan and South Korea if that becomes necessary, or to go back on shore to do it. The real difference is that I would say that, just sort of looking historically, I'm not convinced we necessarily need to have that ability today as much as we need the military and industrial base to build up the capacity to go back on shore. So I think Asia is the most problematic region because I think it's the region where a forced posture for something like this realist internationalism would actually look most similar to the one we have today, at least in Asia. I think there would be small differences. I don't think they would be as big as I think in other regions, they would be dramatically different.
Let's see, so let's go to the Zoom. Eric Higginbotham, over to you.
Thank you, Emma. This is great. I will say that Julian, Eric, and Taylor asked my initial question, and Barry and Taylor asked my backup question. So I'm kind of fresh out of ideas. I will say, first of all, you should add Asia to the title of your talk next time. That was a big mistake on your part. But I will stick with Asia. And I guess for my third question, my second backup, I'll ask, can you say a little bit more about this idea of aggressive burden sharing and how it might apply? I mean, in Asia, you've got countries like the ROK. I shouldn't say like the ROK. You've got the ROK, which spends a lot of spending still. But, let's take a case, Japan, that's spending a little bit more than 1% of GDP right now. What are the strategies to encourage greater spending? How do you play, in a sense, hardball with them without, given the great asymmetry of power in the region, without discouraging them and, perhaps encouraging them to take an alternative approach, which would be a combination of China as opposed to a greater role in balancing China, if that's even the right framework. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah. So again, a good question. And again, I think I'm not an Asia specialist, but unfortunately you have to be these days. It is different in Asia than it is in other regions, right? Because in Asia, there is this concern that other countries will bandwagon with China. If we withdraw too much, if we indicate that we are not a good alternative to China, there is this concern. So, I think in Asia, it's very much about threading the needle of pushing states to build up their own capacity. So not just offering American capabilities in a way that encourages free riding, but simultaneously showing that we will provide sort of complementary capabilities where possible, in a way that encourages them not to simply throw up their hands and shift towards China. And that looks very different, again, in Asia than it does in Europe. In Europe, we can make a credible threat to leave if European states don't actually build up their defense. So I would advocate something like a 10 or 15-year period where the US dials down its commitment to Europe while giving European states the chance to increase their spending, increase their capabilities. But I would advocate I'd say that's not a bluff, right? We should withdraw at the end of that, even if the European states have not built up their capabilities, because once we leave, they will do it much faster. The problem is in Asia, that is not necessarily a credible threat. And so I think the dynamics of burden shifting and burden sharing look very different in Asia than they do in other regions. And so, I think we just have to be cognizant of that problem.
So I think this may be on Europe, although I'm not sure. Victoria Henley.
It is on Europe. I'm going to ask a mildly more easy question. So we know that the Biden administration is very concerned about the EU building up a defense force. And it seems to be a lot of those concerns are rooted in the idea that that might in some way weaken NATO. Do you think that's a legitimate concern, or is that an outmoded way of viewing the problem?
For myself personally, I tend to view it as quite outmoded. I mean, as you know, the US has consistently tried to constrain EU military buildup or EU military development for the reason that it wants to retain its hand in European security. I think what's different this time around, or what's different with the Biden administration, is that they are actually making some incipient moves towards saying, we actually approve of the European Union building up its military capability. So we had a deal just a few weeks back, the PESCO deal, where the US said this is okay, and that's something the US has never said before. And so I think in this administration, I think there's very real limits to how far they're willing to go on this. But I think for the first time, we are actually seeing an administration that's willing to countenance the notion of EU defense. I think there's a lot of interesting questions, I think, about whether EU capabilities and capacity should be improved under the umbrella of NATO or under the European Union umbrella. The French would very much prefer that it happens under the EU umbrella because it shuts the US out entirely and because it benefits their defense industrial base. But to be honest, I think if it's a choice between no improvements in capacity and capability versus improvements under the EU umbrella, I think that still would probably be a win for US foreign policy. So I'm pleased to see the administration taking even baby steps in that direction.
Rich Nielsen.
Hey, Rich Nielsen, associate professor here. So I'm still trying to find the right way to ask this, but does it really count as restraint if the argument is, well, we should be restrained, except there's this China thing, and we should go along with all the folks in Washington who agree that this is a big problem, and so we need some solution there. I'm kind of bouncing off, Barry's question here about like, what would like a genuine restraint option to addressing the rise of China look like? And I guess I've somewhat read like restrainers as trying to balance a budget in some ways. It's really hard. You're being austere and you say, hey, there's only so many things we can do in the world. We're just not going to like try to do them all. And so we're going to give up on goals even when they're hard, right? But it feels like the discussion around China is like, well, but we can't give up on that goal because of course we should seek, sufficiency and not primacy, but not over there. And we should be the first among equals, but not with China, et cetera. And I'm curious if you can say something stronger about like how much restraint is enough, or maybe Washington is so activist with respect to the rise of China that anything less than that counts as restraint. I'm curious if you could say more about that.
Sure.
Also, I know nothing about Asia, so so you're safe with me.
So again, those are both really good questions. So I would say, this is one reason why, with all due respect to Barry, why I would not necessarily call myself a restrainer, is because I don't think restraint in all areas of the world is necessarily the best idea. I think there have been periods in history where restraint and realism, offshore balancing have been very close to each other. I think the last 30 years that's the case. But I think there are periods where that is not the case. And I think if you look at the Cold War, those two were in somewhat different camps during the Cold War. And so I would not necessarily define myself as a restrainer in the theoretical sense because of that difference. And so, for me, and I think for some others, the importance of dialing down in other regions is so that we are more capable and more able to turn towards China, rather than dialing down for its own sake. And so that's what you're, I think, alluding to when you say there's like a budget and you're trying to balance it. So for me, it really is about balance. It's about trying to find a place where we can achieve the really important things for national security, because I actually think China is a concern, and one that has the potential to actually undermine US security and prosperity. I do not think some brush war in the Middle East does that. So that's, for me, it's about, reprioritizing towards the things that really matter. There are, but I will say, however, that there are, I think, some people, restrainers, some people in Washington more generally, who would argue that the US needs to retrench simply because it can't keep going as it has. I do not necessarily think that is accurate. I think we could continue to do a substandard job everywhere and eventually decline as a result. And that's why I favor some retrenchment to deal with other threats. I don't think it's the case that we simply can't afford to do it, if we keep going this way.
Thanks. Raymond Wong.
Thanks for a very interesting talk. I'm Raymond, third year in the program. I guess I'm going to turn, my question is actually about like domestic politics. So I guess at the start of the talk, you said, for the first time in 30 years, you think change in US grant strategy is possible. So I'm wondering, what do you think are the structural and domestic conditions that made such a change possible? And I don't know if that's a simple or very complicated question.
That's a very simple, very, very easy question, or very simple question at least. Very complicated answer, right? I mean, there's a lot of things that play into it here. So like I said in the talk, I really think there's kind of two buckets of causes. And one is just the structural story, right? It's that the US had this unipolar moment where we were sort of head and shoulders above everybody else. That is coming to an end. It is visibly coming to an end. But what's interesting is, just from a social scientific point of view, that can't explain why we're suddenly seeing these debates, because those changes have been visible for some time. They've been visible for more than a decade. And, we haven't seen the conversation until the last few years. And so I think there has been the impact of domestic politics is there. I think what we saw was in 2016, a couple of candidates, particularly Donald Trump, who were willing to say that the war on terror was a mistake, and that in many ways sort of opened up the window for debate on US foreign policy, sort of made the public more aware of some of the flaws in our current foreign policy, of some of the costs of it, particularly again as regards the war on terror. And then we've had very active political campaigns over the last sort of 5 years, basically since Trump was elected, pushing for things like an end to the war in Afghanistan. And so, I think that's the domestic political side of it is, whether it is elite-led, telling people the problems with the war on terror, whether it's population-led, that people are getting fed up with the war on terror, we are seeing this shift on the domestic side. And I think when you combine that with the structural changes, we finally had this sort of space for debate that just wasn't there before.
So let's go back to the Zoom now. First, Sam Leiter. Sam, over to you.
Hi, thank you for your talk, Emma. I like a lot of your work, and I was glad to see you come in today. One thing I was wondering about is, I guess, in terms of this being a right moment for change within U.S. foreign policy, the leaders of some of the foreign policy vision towards China in the last administration and this one, Elbridge Colby and Russ Doshi, have both written with, I think, the intention of a very unrestraint-like posture towards China for the coming, competition with it. I guess, do you think that there is still a possibility for change within the Biden administration, given that both of them and the Trump administration or whatever administration comes next have adopted that policy? And then separately, do you view that, or do you think that there's always going to be some opposition to a restraint policy, given that it requires a relinquishment of some power by the state, agreeing to restraint? And how do you, develop a sort of compelling rationale for relinquishing that power, given the sort of inherent opposition that a state might have to weakening its own position? Thanks again for your talk.
Yeah, thanks. Possibility for change in the Biden administration. There's good and there's bad, right? We've seen some things, just in recent days. We saw them the Pentagon released the forced posture review that had been promised, which said that everything was fine and we should just keep going. So that was a complete sort of waste of time. But at the same time, we saw a sanctions review come out recently, and the unclassified version is only a couple of pages, but it does reflect a lot of the concerns of sort of people in the restraint community, but people elsewhere who said that sanctions and these coercive tools were not, in fact, achieving the goals that the US has been trying to achieve with them. And so, we do see these signs that the administration is at least taking some of these criticisms on board. I think we're going to see in the national security strategy, we're going to see something that is far more focused on domestic politics, and far more focused on sort of thinking about the ways in which domestic and foreign policy interact, rather than necessarily being all sort of China, Russia. I think the Biden administration, is aware of the constraints in US foreign policy, but I think, they are certainly not all the way there to thinking about adopting restraint. But, compared to previous administrations, they are more open to some of these ideas than we've seen in previous administrations. So perhaps this will be a slow process through different administrations. On the question of whether restraint is ever a real possibility because it involves sort of giving things up, I think that's the status quo bias is one problem with arguing for something like a more restrained foreign policy. We saw this in the debates over whether to leave Afghanistan or not, right? We saw the debates, we saw people saying, it's sustainable. It's low cost, it's sustainable, it's only killing about 10 people a year. We can just leave a couple of thousand troops there in perpetuity. And that was sort of the status quo bias. And it took overwhelming opposition from a wide swath of society and politics to overcome that argument. And I think that is the kind of uphill battle that restrainers are going to face in a lot of spheres. I think the one reason for optimism is that there is a fairly broad coalition or a fairly broad understanding that US foreign policy has problems and needs reform. And I think, for restrainers, I think the opportunity is, can we take that understanding that reform is needed and channel it in a productive direction? That I think is the question, not so much whether you could, find an administration that will impose every tenet of restraint tomorrow. I don't think that's particularly feasible.
Great, thanks. So sticking on the Zoom, next up is Jim Walsh. Jim, over to you.
Thanks very much. Thanks for leading us into a wonderful conversation. I wanted to pick up where Rich was asking about China and being someone who knows nothing about China. I thought that was a good precedent, and I want to push it further. I guess to be really simple about it, one might ask themselves, well, what is the greater danger vis-a-vis China? Is the danger that we're going to underestimate China and they're going to surprise us in ways to our disadvantage? Or are we more likely to overestimate the Chinese threat and perhaps produce a escalation spiral in different domains? It would seem to me that if you thought that the second was more likely, and I don't know which is more likely, I sort of feel like the second's more likely because I've been hearing China threat for a long time now, but whatever. If you thought the second was more likely, you would think that the case for restraint would be more important, not less important. And you can imagine a situation where the restrainers could win in Europe and win these other areas where it is easier. And because it wasn't part of the conversation vis-a-vis China, you lose in the net because you get what happens in China swamps everything else. So I'm just putting that out there as a question. And then a minor thing, super minor thing, but in terms of giving feedback on the presentation, I wonder if about the tension between restraint and leverage over our allies in this sort of way, in the budgetary way that Rich talked about before. Talked about the US pulls back. We expect our allies to do more for themselves, fend for themselves in the face of reality. And then you also sort of talked about other sorts of things that have to happen to fill in the space from our removal, and that we'll ask our friends to help with that. But aren't we asking our friends to help with that at the moment where we have less leverage than we did before and they're preoccupied with building up their own scene? And I wonder if that math works out on the budget. Thanks very much.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point, the one about leverage. I tend to think that if we're not really getting anything for our leverage right now, then there is probably not a huge downside in trying the withdraw and then maybe build a more approach. I mean, it's effectively, if this approach hasn't worked, then what leverage did we ever really have? But I accept I accept the point, and I think that there is a broader point to be made, which is that we, in applying this kind of restraint or realism, whatever, to American foreign policy, we are inherently accepting that we are probably going to give up some leverage in other regions of the world. We are accepting that as a cost in exchange for the other benefits that we would get from retrenchment. And I still think that's a fair trade-off, but it's one that should be acknowledged. On the question of China, whether we underestimate or overestimate it, I think right now we're very much overestimating it. I did a paper earlier this year, actually, that I think kind of got at this question. And it was, we were trying to figure out why everyone in Washington was suddenly talking about great power competition. Where the hell did this phrase come from? What did it actually mean? And what we ended up sort of narrowing it down to was that great power competition, the way people in Washington are talking about it, is basically an assumption about revisionist intentions in China. It's the assumption that China's rise is not just in capabilities, but it is in intentions, and that China is necessarily expansionist, and if we sort of, they're going to try and take, one country after another. I think you can see the clearest example of this in Elbridge Colby's recent book, in which he literally basically says that that's what China's going to do. And I think, that assumption, whether it's deeply held or explicitly held, I think that's what's driving a lot of the debate about China and Washington. And I think that is leading us to overestimate them, because what we know from the literature is that revisionism is rarely absolute, right? It's almost always about specific ends, specific goals. It's usually bounded. Revisionism is usually bounded. And the challenge, I think, for US policymakers is to figure out what that bound is for China. What is it that China cares about? And I wouldn't pretend to actually know the answer to this because I'm not a China specialist, but it's to hedge our bets while trying to figure out what it is that they're actually trying to get. So not necessarily assuming that China's revisionism is unbounded, that they're trying to push us out of Asia entirely, but trying to figure out where are we more likely to see conflicts because it's something they really care about. I think Taiwan sort of looms large in this picture. And where are the areas where they really don't care about it so much and conflict is less likely?
Okay. Sticking with our third colleague on the Zoom, not the Zoom. Over to you, Dick Samuels.
Thanks, Taylor, and thanks, Emma. This was just the right talk for this audience, and we really appreciated it. I'm going to take us back to Asia again, and like others, I was stimulated by something. Sorry about that. I was stimulated by something that Rich said when he asked the question, sort of in passing, how much restraint is enough? And I thought maybe we might also re-ask, because it came up, in the comparison with Europe, which is how much restraint is too much. And in thinking about that, your earlier response suggested that the most likely outcome of too much restraint in Asia would be the accommodation of the middle powers, ROK, Japan, to Chinese power in the region. But there's another alternative, and it's one that those of us who do study Asia have sort of found in the air. It's in the ether in Asia right now, which is nuclear proliferation. And we haven't talked about that. So I wonder if you could speak to that alternative and whether and how much. Certainly we should be concerned, so it's not whether, but how much we should be concerned, in your view, about the nuclear breakout by ROK or Japan. They're the most likely first movers in all of this. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. I mean, again, really good question. So, I think on the question of sort of how much restraint is too much, let me just say, I guess, that my own thinking on this was really informed by Stephen Wertheim's excellent history book, Tomorrow the World. And in it, it's intended to be a history of how the notion of isolationism or of internationalism without military components got demonized in US foreign policy. And there's a really good book on that front. But the thing that really shaped my thinking was he goes through in depth the deliberations of US planners during World War II as they tried to think about what order would look like afterwards. And they tried to think through sort of what could the US tolerate in terms of being restricted out of other areas of the world. And I'm sure this was not his intent, but what I came away from that book thinking is that is one of the questions that we should be asking ourselves today. Is the American prosperity, if we are restricted purely to sort of the Americas, to the Western Hemisphere, American prosperity will suffer substantially. And I think, for me, that is where I think that line should be. I don't think we can tolerate that. And so I think that is the level of restraint that is too much, at least for me. But that is my personal opinion. But I would commend that book just for it's a great sociological history of a group of really smart people trying to think through similar problems to the ones we're facing today and coming up with imperfect solutions. And I thought that was great. In terms of the question of accommodation versus nuclear proliferation in Asia, again, I'm just going to point you guys to other great work. So Jenny Lind and Darrell Press had a paper, some of you have probably seen it already recently, arguing effectively that the Republic of Korea should consider getting nuclear weapons as a deterrent to China. And I think from the point of view of US policymakers, that's a bit of a double-edged sword, right? I can see how it would certainly resolve some of the concerns about US forward presence in Asia and potentially creating a conflict with China while trying to protect other countries or bolster them. At the same time, nuclear proliferation is not necessarily cost-free, right? There are risks, there are hazards. We know that accidents happen. We know that humans are fallible. So more nuclear proliferation is not necessarily a good thing. So I am quite ambivalent about that, and I'm just going to leave that question open. But I would encourage everybody to go and read that paper. It's really excellent.
Bill Hunt.
So thanks, Emma. It's been a very interesting talk. I come from the Naval War College where we talk about China all the time and where the U.S. Navy has just been enthralled by the China threat and the ability to potentially get more resources, which led me to the how-to. The how-to question of how to implement this strategy. First, you give the indication that variation in not only parties, U.S. political parties, but within U.S. political parties give potentially some space for this. So where does this foreign policy land? In other words, who do you want to get elected in order to have a chance for this policy? The other is I've been thinking about budget. And so it seems very difficult to actually reduce the U.S. budget, military budget, to be able to force some of this restraint. And so if you can't reduce a budget, one of the things you can do is prioritize the budget to kind of force the type of movement. And so I think in terms of the spending on nuclear forces, not to expand it, but for replacement and that high level expenses as a way to shift down some of that spending. And so it leads me to think about what does a military sufficiency look like? In other words, what capabilities you want to give up? What capabilities would you want to take on if you have to spend the same amount on budget? So two very different questions. One is in terms of who do you want to win elections to do what you want to do? And how do you get your military force structure to be the sufficient force structure that you're looking for? Thanks.
Yeah, so within the parties, right now the restrainers, such as they are, they don't necessarily agree with everything, but broadly construed restrainers, right now fit within either the progressive wing of the Democratic Party or within the more sort of conservative nationalist or even paleo-conservative wing of the Republican Party. So people like Matt Gaetz, for example, who has many other problems that we won't discuss, but was a strong supporter of the withdrawal from Afghanistan, right? Very Trumpian, very focused on sort of not wasting money on overseas, nation building, right? Mike Lee in the Senate, for example. So people like that. On the Democratic side of the aisle, it's people like Bernie Sanders, Chris Murphy, Ilhan Omar, right, Ro Khanna, who are among the most liberal in the political sense, in the democratic sense of the word, the most progressive members of the Senate, and who typically are coming at this out of an anti-war background, but who have, in many cases, embraced the actual sort of more theoretical understanding of restraint or realism. So those are the places where I think restrainers have found a foothold for their ideas. I think the interesting question, you say, how do you implement the strategy? The interesting question is whether that is enough or whether it needs to broaden out. And I think it needs to broaden out. So I think we need, within the Democratic Party, I think we need mainstream former liberal internationalist Democrats to come around to adopting this strategy, because I don't think just the progressives are going to be enough. So in the second question on budget, I think we could have a whole debate about the budget stuff, about whether restraint would be cheaper or not. There's been an ongoing debate about that. I'll point you to a really good CSBA, the Center for the Study of Budgets. They did a really good study a few years back where they basically got teams from the major DC think tanks, like Center for American Progress, AEI, Cato, to do their, to say, what would your budget be under your preferred strategy? And it's got like 5 options. And so it's a really good overview of where you might save money or not under restraint. But I mean, just in general terms, how I would think about this, if I was thinking about prioritizing even just the budget that we have, strongly prioritize naval and air assets over land power, and then trying to avoid the sort of high level arms race spending that we're starting to see. So we've got, the nuclear modernization process here, China's nuclear modernization there, questions about missile defense. You could see how that could become a very expensive cycle very fast. We can almost certainly get more bang for our buck elsewhere if we avoid that sort of arms race.
Wonderful. Well, Emma, thanks so much for a terrific talk. I know we worked you hard. There is lunch coming. Maybe we talked more about China than you were hoping, but it's something that has been on our minds and clearly is part of the debate. But really, thank you so much.
Come on.